Our partners at Lever News have re-upped, new and improved their podcast, which is called Lever Time. We're really excited to be joined this morning by that podcast producer, Arun Singh, who is the Lever's senior podcast producer and has a fantastic new episode that I really recommend you guys check out, going inside the Biden administration's internal discussions and policy vis-a-vis Israel. Arun, welcome. Great to have you.
Good to see you, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
So before I get into this podcast, I just want to sing your praises. You know, I've told this to David. I've been talking to Saagar. You're doing such an excellent job in terms of the quality of these podcasts. I've enjoyed all of them. I'm a big fan. So let's go ahead. Why don't you break down for us this particular episode and some of the things you learned about who's most influential behind the scenes in terms of Israel's quote unquote bear hug of Netanyahu?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this episode, we began by looking a little bit at why Israel means so much to the United States, and in particular to President Biden, who has long considered himself one of Israel's strongest allies in the U.S. government. Inside of the White House during what's happening right now, though, I spoke with Akbar Shahid Ahmed, the Huffington Post diplomacy reporter, and he illuminated me to the fact that there are really three people inside of this administration who have consolidated power and taken control of Israel policy. And that is Secretary of State Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, but most importantly is someone who many people have never heard of. He's a gentleman named Brett McGurk. He's an advisor to President Biden. He's been a staffer for his entire career. He has gone between the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, now to Biden. And he is the one who has really pushed Biden to take up things that people who have observed Biden were surprised at, such as a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia, which would involve a mutual defense pact, including sharing civilian nuclear technology. Brett McGurk's career, though, really started during the Iraq War when he was tasked with more or less the Bush administration's goal of rebuilding Iraq. And I would say that was really not a successful, beneficial, or humane policy, yet he has continued through government as a staffer. And being a staffer, he rarely gives interviews. He sits kind of behind the scenes. And I think that is something that has alarmed State Department officials. People inside of the diplomatic community say that they've been felt locked out. And Akbar told me a lot of that has to do with Brett McGurk, who really seems to have idea of ego and kind of his own desires that he's pushed Biden on these issues.
Yeah, I know Brett McGurk. Actually, I don't know him personally. I've covered him for many years. Like you said, for Iraq, Syria, he was at the heart of that, famously resigned from the Trump administration, but come back. He's kind of the preeminent, it's almost like a World War II-esque type figure, like the bipartisan foreign policy connoisseur, but you're very correct to point that out. So one of the things that we wanted to get your reaction to was not only the kind of evolution of the pro-Israel policy inside of the Biden administration, but also of broader Washington, where there does seem to be a complete cosign, really, of Israeli military strategy, perhaps best exemplified by Senator Lindsey Graham. You can see both the emotion and the support here he has, and clearly, obviously there's at least a taste of this inside the Biden administration as well. In a recent interview, he suggested that there should be nukes employed against Gaza by the Israelis. Let's take a listen to what he said.
Can I say this? Why is it okay for America to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end their existential threat war? Why was it okay for us to do that? I thought it was okay. To Israel, do whatever you have to do to survive as a Jewish state.
Senator, again, military officials say the technology has changed. But let me ask you about how all
these
of this
military officials that you're talking about
let me ask you something.
Full of crap.
So, what'd you make of that?
The shuffling of the papers emphasizes that point.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think, as you said, Saagar, that underscores how emotional this issue is, and also that someone like Lindsey Graham feels completely comfortable to say that as a sitting senator. I mean, that's a pretty ridiculous comparison. On the one hand, World War II was a completely different issue than Israel and Gaza. The machinations that had to go into World War II were largely surrounding, will one of the worst wars in human history continue? And, and I'm not justifying what they did in World War II, but to use that as an example to justify a completely one-sided war. I mean, Israel is clearly on the dominant side of this war. Over 35,000 Palestinian civilians have died. The numbers are nowhere near in comparison, even taking into what happened on October 7th. So I think for Lindsey Graham to say that we should just go in and drop a nuclear bomb, it shows how comfortable the bipartisan consensus is that you can make such an extreme statement. If Lindsey Graham had said we should drop a nuclear bomb in Iraq or Afghanistan, I do wonder, would that have gotten the same level of acceptance? I mean, that clip that you just showed, I didn't see that registered in New York Times, Washington Post. Yep. If Lindsey Graham had said, hey, we should just go and drop a giant nuke on North Korea, I imagine that's something that you would see the mainstream media absolutely jumping on top of. But it does seem like that kind of a comment is, hey, par for the course in Washington, even if it sounds absurd.
I mean, he's not even the first member of Congress to suggest such a thing. Like, that's what's so crazy is or, member of official in Israel. They've also, some of them have suggested nuking Gaza, and it just sort of goes by as a blip. Meanwhile, I saw pictures this morning of college student protesters who were being charged with felonies under some 1950s era rule against masking that was put in place to combat the KKK. They're being charged with felonies for protesting and, rally chants that people don't like. And you've got a sitting senator who has actual power suggesting you nuke the Gaza Strip, and it's barely a blip. You barely hear about it.
Someone who's considered a statesman by people within his own party.
Exactly.
Great point. Yes. That's such a great point. I wanted to ask you about another development in terms of the Biden administration and their policy, which is, while you have, and Biden has always operated this way where he has a very small group of advisors and they're basically the only ones that count. And any newcomers, anyone from the outside, is very difficult to break through. I mean, he's been in Washington for 50 years and very locked into his ways. Not to mention, it seems like he personally has a deep ideological commitment to the Israeli cause, grounded on, a visit he had with Golda Meir in the 70s or whatever. But it's not uniform across the Biden administration. There are some individuals who, especially in positions in the State Department, who really do dissent from this direction. And that's been manifested in a number of ways. You've had some of these anonymous letters of Biden staffers or Kamala Harris staffers who will say, we're very upset about this, but very anonymous. You've had a few different resignations. And this is the latest one, which I think is quite extraordinary and quite powerful. We can put this up on the screen. The letter that was written, this was from, just pause this for a second. This is from U.S. Army Major Harrison Mann. And part of what he said is that he felt so alone going about his business. He was disturbed by the footage from Gaza, but he talks about how he had, all of this sort of rationalizations of, well, if it wasn't me, someone else would be doing this job, and my work here doesn't really matter that much anyway. But he says, I now realize the obvious. If I was afraid to voice my concerns, you were too. I've always known what kind of people you are, and I should have had more faith in this team. So I am deliberately not sending this to the entire agency. I'm writing to people I know who might value hearing the reasons I chose to walk away. He also talks about how, as someone who is Jewish and was raised Jewish, how this moral imperative of never again and the inadequacy of just following orders was really impressed upon him from a young age. And so because of those moral conscious reasons, he resigned from the Biden administration. Do you have first of all, just react to this letter and this resignation, and do you have a sense of how widespread this dissent from the Biden administration top-line policy is among sort of rank-and-file individuals such as this?
Yeah, I think what's really remarkable about this letter, and even thinking about Aaron Bushnell, who, did the self-immolation in front of the Israeli embassy, these are not people who come from the traditional anti-war constituencies. These are not activists. These are people who signed up for the U.S. military, many of them in the wake of what we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, they had convictions that they believed in what the military was doing. They believed in the United States government. And it says something to me that what they saw in Gaza, what they saw is a lack of ability to dissent, which inside of government, usually you have traditional dissent channels. they didn't feel that they were able to properly dissent to the point that they went back on what they believed in, and they decided to resign. In Arun's case, very sadly, he committed a self-immolation. And I've heard that from State Department officials too. I spoke with one State Department official in January. He had worked on Iraq policy. He had worked on Ukraine policy. This is not someone who had an issue necessarily with the fact that the United States arms different nations. He said that in arms transfers, you start with the goal of how do you not do harm, but with how do you do harm reduction. He didn't necessarily debate that idea that you would be sending weapons, but what he saw happening with Israel was this rapid acceleration of getting weapons over there, the complete squashing of dissent. And he told me that he felt the debate was stifled, and that similarly to Mann, he was not able to adequately speak out against these things. And these are the people who are going public. But when I spoke with that official in January, he said there were many, many more people who privately said, I completely agree with you. And when I spoke with Akbar, he said something similarly to me. And so I do think that this is a very widespread problem within the State Department, especially for people who feel that in areas they've traditionally been able to provide dissent, in this policy, there are communications and there are directives coming down from the top. The State Department officials said it was coming from White House and top level State Department, Blinken, Sullivan, McGurk, and they were not able to push back on this. They weren't even able to debate the righteousness of this policy, much less the speed of which things were happening. So I do think that what we're seeing is very remarkable within the United States government. For government officials, it takes a lot to resign, particularly in the case of the person we saw a couple weeks ago, 18 years at the State Department. Josh Paul, more than a decade at the State Department. These people built entire careers and they left. And that is just absolutely astounding to me in the way this administration is carrying this out.
Arjun, what's your sense of whether there is a realization that the quote unquote bear hug strategy has utterly and completely failed? And what's your sense of whether there is an actual policy shift going on right now with the Biden administration versus a rhetorical one? And of course, I'm referring to the fact that he said, listen, if they do a quote unquote major invasion of Rafah, we're going to cut off some weapons shipments, but they've so far deemed what is the invasion that has already happened in Rafah doesn't cross that red line for whatever reason. So it really does leave it open to interpretation whether this is an actual shift or whether it's, an attempt to sort of pacify, a left and young cohort in the party that is outraged over the atrocities that they see being committed.
Yeah, I think in terms of this being a successful policy, it's not been a successful policy. And it is something that for Biden has politically failed for him. He has given a lot of his administration's re-election chances to, as you said, bear hugging Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu is quickly becoming isolated on the world stage. Akbar told me foreign allies are consistently saying to Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, why are you doing this? Why are you allowing this to continue? You have control over the situation. And there was a moment that I saw where India's foreign minister actually said during a speech that he felt that the Palestinians had been denied sovereignty for a homeland. And India under Modi had been and has been one of the strongest allies of Netanyahu. Modi and Netanyahu are very close with each other. And that's, again, another remarkable statement to show that even a very strong ally who believes in this idea of what Israel is trying to do, create this religious dominant state, they feel the need to have to speak out and tell their allies in their region that, look, we don't agree necessarily with all of these full objectives. As far as, is this something that is really a change? I'm skeptical of that, to be honest, Krystal. This is a pause on a certain package of bombs. It feels a little bit mealy-mouthed. And I haven't seen Biden give a really forceful statement. He's given very taciturn comments saying, I told them that if they went into Rafah, we would not provide these weapons. We've told them. There's leaks to, Peter Baker at the New York Times that he had a tough conversation with Netanyahu. He privately told him, I'm considering changing my mind. Yeah, that is not a strong change of heart to me. I think a real change of heart would be a reconsideration of the historic policy of arming Israel, and also a reconsideration of whether the United States should be supporting Israel in no matter what kind of policy. That I have not seen a change of heart. And Josh Paul, who was one of the first people to resign from the State Department, he said something similar. He said it was a good sign, but it doesn't portend a long-term shift.
Yeah, I think that's all very well said. Arjun, great to talk to you. Congrats again. Guys, I can't recommend Lever Time enough. It really is an excellent product. You'll learn a lot from it. And you guys have tackled a lot of really important and interesting topics, including airlines, which Lever News had a big hand in forcing some changes through, including the oil price fixing, which we covered here as well with Matt Stoller. So definitely check out the podcast, guys. And great to meet you, Arjun.
Good to see you, man.
Great to meet you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.